Gustavus Adolphus is celebrated today as the father of modern warfare. By focusing on infantry firepower rather than melee troops or heavy cavalry, he was able to score victories across Poland and Germany. He was posthumously entitled the Great by the Swedish Parliament, much in the vein of Alexander. Later on, he was celebrated by great generals like Napoleon Bonaparte and George S. Patton. Historians have attributed to him major military inventions, like the paper cartridge and uniforms. Some even call him the inventor of total war. Of course, these attributions are much too dramatic. Paper cartridges were used almost 100 years before Gustavus' heyday. He didn't really invent anything, but was very good at combining different things that he learned, ranging from the tactical to technological. In this video, we'll be taking a look at how these innovations were combined together into what has been considered the most effective military force of its day. An army doesn't just come out of nowhere. It needs men to become soldiers, and those men are not always so easy to find, especially in a sparsely populated country like Finland, Sweden. When Gustavus took over the country, he knew that he had to find an effective way of mustering a large army. In 1623, Gustavus Adolphus had created a permanent army of 40,000 soldiers from Sweden and Finland. The primary method of recruitment was conscription, which was quite uncommon in a Europe reliant on mercenaries and militias. However, Gustavus did not invent the Swedish conscription system. The model had been used since the Middle Ages and was reformed in the 1520s by his grandfather. The old army had essentially been a royal militia and was only good at defending home territory. Gustavus wanted an army that could fight offensively and conquer foreign lands. This required a steady manpower pool, so he had the conscription system reformed. The key to the Swedish conscription were the parish priests. They served as local administrators, keeping tabs on the adult men that were fit for military service. The priests would also spread state propaganda, instilling war support in the population. They said that the offensive wars were meant to protect Sweden from foreign invasions and economic blockades, which had been everyday since the last few decades. Religious and nationalistic propaganda was also used. Most of Sweden's enemies were Catholic, while Sweden was strictly Protestant. The Old Testament is full of warlike material. Some of the peasantry were told that they were the descendants of the warlike Goths that had marched out of Sweden to conquer the world. Gustavus' regulations of 1620 made all males over 15 years old liable for conscription. Conscription was usually ordered every other year, sometimes more. The men of a district were divided into files of 10 men and lined up before army commissioners in the local meeting hall. One man was selected from the 10, usually a robust peasant of 18 to 40 years of age. He was then either sent to the army or navy. But if a peasant had enough money, he might pay another man to join the army in his stead. After the recruit had been selected, he was sent off to his regiment, where he received equipment and intensive training. Foreigners were astonished how these mere peasant boys could be turned into disciplined soldiers. Due to the small size of the Swedish population, Gustavus could only recruit so many national conscripts before the people started rebelling. Eventually he had to turn to foreign mercenaries for manpower. The Swedish administration called them enlisted to distinguish them from conscripted troops. They were mostly volunteers raised by a recruitment party. Most of them were foreigners, typically German, attracted into the Swedish army by the lust for money and adventure. Enemy prisoners were also recruited into the ranks. The mercenary system was entirely reliant on enterprising officers who had enough money to recruit them. In some cases, entire regiments or armies were recruited from abroad, typically from the British Isles. Since the different mercenaries formed such a huge part of Gustavus' army, I'll have to cover them in their own videos. The cornerstone of Gustavian military reforms were the provincial regiments. Every province in Finland and Sweden had its own provincial regiment, consisting of 3,600 men. They were led by a land colonel and his officer staff. There were also several administrators present in the regiment, including clerks, provosts and priests. As you can imagine, these helped a lot with cohesion and also morale. The provincial regiment consisted of 3 field regiments of 1,200 men each. They were divided across 8 companies of 150 men. In theory, every company consisted of 134 soldiers and a company staff of 16. The company staff included the captain and his officers, a standard bearer, musicians, etc. It was unusual for an army of this time to have such a high amount of officers. This improved unit discipline and allowed the units to operate more flexibly on the battlefield. It also gave more men an opportunity for social climbing through military service. The national regiments consisted of soldiers from the same local area, meaning that they shared traditions and dialects. Keep in mind that the Swedish language varies immensely from region to region, especially back in the 1600s when we didn't have railways or television. There were entirely different languages present in the nation, like Finnish and Sami. As you might imagine, the system of provincial regiments enhanced the soldiers' camaraderie and was vital for the morale. People back then identified themselves more with their local province than they did with their nation. During a campaign, the Swedish army divided its pool of manpower into a temporary structure called a squadron. It was later renamed battalion. Every battalion consisted of 4 companies, so a battalion was around 600 men. 3 or 4 squadrons formed a brigade. Thus, the permanent administrative units, which we previously discussed, the regiment and the company, were easily transformed into operational formations for the campaign and battlefield. The Swedish brigade is actually one of the few innovations that can be directly credited to Gustavus, or at least his staff. An infantryman was either a pikeman or musketeer. Pikemen fought in tight, enclosed formations, forming a wall of pikes that could deter cavalry and engage with other infantry units at close quarters. Whilst the pike was popular in the rest of Europe, this hadn't really been the case in Sweden, which was used to fighting in the forest. The Swedes initially struggled against the Polish cavalry armies due to their lack of pikemen. Gustavus did his best to increase their numbers. His battalions consisted of 216 pikemen and 192 musketeers. Thus, the ratio of musketeers to pikemen was larger than in the imperial armies, but lower than the Dutch armies, which were his prime inspiration. Since the pikeman partook in melee combat, he was equipped in full armor, called a harness. It included a back and breastplate, a gorget for the neck, tassets for the thighs, and a helmet. The helmets were mass-produced in Sweden after the Dutch design, and were known as storm hats. Swedish soldiers also wore the Moravian helmet, typically associated with the Spanish. Both pikemen and musketeers were expected to wear a helmet during battle. However, armor wasn't popular with the Swedes. At the Battle of Breitenfeld, most Swedes had ditched their armor. After Gustavus' death, more pikemen converted themselves to musketeers. In 1635, Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna wrote that it was no longer necessary to send armor to the pikemen in Germany, because they were little used and tended to get thrown away on the long marches so typical of the campaign. I can attest that soldiers are lazy and will do anything to lighten their loads. Despite our fascination with toy soldier formations of uniformal pikes, the official length of pikes was seldom maintained. Robert Monroe, a Scottish major in Swedish service, wrote that the pikemen cut off the lengths of their pikes, as often seen upon marches, being very uncomely to see a squadron of pikes, not all of one length. Then there was the musketeer. His principal armament was, of course, the musket. Well, it wasn't that simple. Just like the pikes, equipment wasn't uniformal. From what I've gathered, the Swedish infantry used 3 types of firearms. Additionally, these types varied in size and shape. During the 1500s, Swedes had used light firearms simply called rör, meaning pipes. They were equivalent to the English caliver. I've discussed them in length in my video on weird Renaissance weaponry. One of them used a burning mushroom to ignite the gunpowder. Anyway, the mushroom lock seems to have faded out of relevancy by the early 1600s. Instead, Swedish troops in the 1610s and 1620s primarily used snaplock calibers. These were shorter and lighter than muskets, had a short and curved stock like an arquebus. The snaplock was an early rendition of the flintlock, and much more unreliable. Apparently it misfired 1 in 5 shots. Though Gustavus tried to replace them, they were used well into the 1630s. The matchlock musket was much heavier and weighed around 7.5 kilos. Some generals considered it too burdensome for the average soldier. The benefit of a heavy musket was that it was better used as a 2-handed club. The muskets of this period had their stock carved like an axe to better bash in heretical heads. Effective bayonets had yet to be invented. It wasn't until 1592 that the musket appeared in Sweden, and by the 1620s it coexisted with the snaplock. The musket did a lot of damage, but its recoil was crazy, and it needed a forked rest to be aimed reliably. For a brief period in the Polish War, Swedish musketeers used a short pike called a swine's feather instead of the forked rest. The swine's feather had a pike head and a hook for resting the musket on, and could be fixed in the ground to defend against cavalry charges. Contrary to popular belief, the swine's feather was not invented by the Swedes and originated from the Netherlands. It was first used by the Swedes around 1625, but by 1628 they had completely abandoned it. I'm not sure why. Around 1630, Gustavus ordered the production of lighter matchlock muskets. These could be aimed without a forked rest and were much more comfortable. Many believe that the entirety of Gustavus's army was armed with lighter weaponry, but that isn't the case. It wasn't until 1655 that the heavy muskets were finally abandoned by the Swedish army. As mentioned before, Gustavus is often credited for issuing his troops with paper cartridges, which would have made the reloading faster. Evidence points to the Swedish army using bandoliers until at least 1670. Bandoliers are flasks of powder stored in a belt across your chest. However, some scholars believe that soldiers privately adapted paper cartridges. Both pikemen and infantrymen were equipped with swords. Sadly, we don't really know what Swedish infantry swords looked like. Compared to cavalry and officers' swords, they were simpler and of poorer quality. In theory, the infantryman was supposed to buy it himself, but in practice, many just didn't have a sword and went with an axe instead. In 1630, Gustavus started supplying swords centrally. It has traditionally been said that soldiers from the 30 Years' War dressed in civilian clothes, but this is simply not true. In 1621, Gustavus wrote that new conscripts should not arrive in their farm habits and with their long jackets, since foreigners would see them and spread spiteful rumors. We know that these early Gustavian soldiers wore clothing distinct from civilians. However, the color was far from glamorous. They were dressed in the grey and white associated with the peasantry. English, Polish and Swedish sources alike confirmed that the Swedes were disciplined soldiers, but looked like labourers or shabby peasants. It wasn't until 1627 that the Swedish textile industry had developed enough for larger production of coloured clothing. However, there weren't any national colours. Regiments were given cloth, but had to commission a tailor themselves to make the soldiers' clothes. An Englishman remarked in 1627 that he saw Swedish soldiers in red, yellow, green and blue. The pants and jacket usually had the same colour, since they were made from the same issue of cloth. Blue clothing was preferred by the army, however. If blue wasn't available, they went with red or brown. In Germany there was even less of a permanent uniform, and the soldiers were issued whatever was available and looked nice. Gustavus wanted them to look like proper soldiers, and many witnesses were impressed, contrary to the rumors from Poland. Blue and yellow clothing seems to have been popular, but sometimes they were given red or whatever else they could purchase or plunder. At Breitenfeld, the Swedish front line wore blue and yellow cassocks, a sort of tabard. After Gustavus' death, the campaign dragged on, and clothing deteriorated. In the late 1630s, the Swedish army in Germany became legendary for its scruffiness. In Czech, the word Šved is synonymous with a man in rags. Gustavus did employ several regiments named after colours, but that wasn't due to the uniform, rather because of the colour of their flags. The Green Regiment had green flags, for example. Indeed, on the battlefield, banners and flags were the most common manner in which to identify your troops. Field words were also used. The Swedes had Gott mit uns in the 1630s and Hilf Herr Jesus in the 40s. Some say that the Swedes wore blue scarves as a battlefield sign. We know that the imperial armies wore red scarves from 32 onwards, but can't be certain if the Swedes did. Those scarves are fairly expensive and only really worn by officers. There is as much evidence of the Swedes wearing green scarves as their field sign. However, most reliable evidence points to them using something much more rudimentary. At Breitenfeld, Swedish troops wore green sprigs in their headgear. This was mocked by a contemporary illustrator when he depicted the exotic races in the Swedish army: a Scot, a Sami and a Latvian. Note that the Sami is eating his field sign. After Breitenfeld, Swedish troops tied a band of straw around their arm or in their headgear as a field sign. This was used for the rest of the century. Gustavus wasn't as much an innovator as he was great at utilizing and combining existing methods and technology. His other great strength was the realization that cooperation was necessary for any form of success. These two personality traits were profound in his military tactics. The infantry were deployed as follows during battle. The pikemen stood in a rectangular pike block, 6 files deep. 50 paces behind were the musketeers. They could advance to either side of the pike block to give fire. A smaller block of surplus musketeers kept behind the main force to provide a reserve. The biggest strength of the Gustavian army was the cooperation between different unit types, what has commonly been called combined arms today. The cavalry relied on musketeers to soften up their enemies before charging in with their swords. When firing, the musketeers were deployed in 3 ranks. The first rank kneeled, the second crouched, and the third stood straight. When the musketeers were loaded, the pikemen attacked and disrupted the enemy. To increase the firepower of the infantry units, light copper cannons were developed. They could be moved by a few men and follow the infantry during battle. Morale was very high in the Gustavian army and vital for its operations. The Swedes believed that they were defending their country and religion. The men fought side by side with comrades from their home province. The most vital piece to enforce morale and discipline was Gustavus' Articles of War. The earliest draft was read out in 1621 before Gustavus departed to conquer Riga. Religious zeal was major in the articles. Services were held every morning and evening in the army camp, and attendance was mandatory. If a soldier misused God's name, he was forfeit half a month's pay, and at the next service he would lie on his knees in the middle of the ring. Whoever mocked the service was clapped in irons on the first 2 offenses, and on the third he was executed by firing squad. You were also executed if you deserted or mocked the king's name. You were likewise executed if you abandoned your banner without defending it. Cowardly officers were chased out of the camp. If both officers and soldiers had done wrong, they were subject to the ancient practice of decimation. Every 10 men was selected through lottery and hanged. The survivors were forced to clean the camp, especially the latrines. Most armies of the time supplied themselves by plundering the local area for provisions. Gustavus knew this would slow down the army and weaken it, since it had to spread out over a large area. He also disliked plundering because it would weaken the surroundings' future potential in supplying his troops. In his army, plundering was heavily regulated and punishable. Instead, the troops were supplied via a rigid system of logistics. That's not to say that plundering didn't happen. In Poland, Gustavus carried out a lot of raids and devastation in a war of attrition. In Germany, plundering occurred widely as well, mostly because there was seldom enough money to pay the troops, partly because the Swedish state kept giving out generous donations during its participation in the war. Sometimes, Gustavus was unable to prevent his soldiers from plundering their allies, as was the case in Brandenburg. The Swedes gained an awful reputation as destructive during the 30 Years' War. The emperor ordered that no Swedish prisoners were to be taken, just executed on spot. However, some sources, both contemporary and modern, dispute this as being done by actual Swedes and Finns, instead laying the blame on the less disciplined mercenaries from Germany. Gustavus sometimes did his best to regulate plundering. These regulations were decided before entering the city. If the city had resisted, plunder was free and used to punish the defeated. If the city had surrendered, plundering was forbidden. Still, it did happen. In München, only abandoned houses were plundered. When some soldiers broke the regulations and killed a few citizens, they were hanged. What can be said on Swedish plundering is that it did happen, and it's definitely a complicated topic. The combination of military might, discipline, and strong Christianity would form a great inspiration for the New Model Army, created by Oliver Cromwell in England. Many of his soldiers had in fact fought with the Swedes in Germany. After the soldier had received his training, he'd be lucky to receive garrison duty in his home area. Otherwise, he'd be sent overseas. Best chance then was garrison duty. Worst chance was the front lines. A regiment usually had its soldiers distributed across the Baltic. In 1634, the regiment of Österbotten had 956 soldiers at home and 488 in Germany. Gustavus' time in Poland was kinda chill. He battled during the summer, and when winter came, he went back to Sweden to manage internal and private affairs. For his troops who had to stay on the front lines, it wasn't so pleasant. Very few soldiers returned home alive. In one province of Sweden, only 15 out of 300 soldiers returned. Most of them had died from awful field conditions and disease. Indeed, the casualties that Sweden sustained were nowhere close to the German losses of the 30 Years' War. But in relation to overall populations, The Swedish casualties were comparable to what the US lost during their civil war, or Japan in World War II. Farms stood empty across the country, and there were much more women around than men. In the countryside, it meant that women had to take on men's duties. This illustration by Italian diplomat Lorenzo Magalotti shows Swedish women being forced into rowing a boat, since there are no men around to do so. They need a hero, but he died from the Black Plague in Germany. Soldiers that returned home had trouble adapting to civilian life. They had seen terrible things, done terrible things, and had been doing so for many years. Their everyday routines and worries had been totally different from the civilian lifestyle. This is part of why it took so long for the war to end. So many people began to depend on it. Soldiers that returned home often behaved violently. Others did their best to troll the government by avoiding service. Individual conscripts would flee into the woodlands and become self-sufficient. This was quite common for Swedish outlaws in general, and had been for hundreds of years. Oftentimes they were viewed in a sort of romantic, roguish manner. Conscripts might also self-mutilate to avoid recruitment, such as cutting off their thumbs. A company of soldiers revolted in 1627 and turned to banditry, but were quickly put down, their heads put on display across farmyard fences. Armed uprisings were rare for this reason. The army was great at putting them down. Propaganda was also effective, and the peasantry had representation in the parliament, and could voice their concerns that way. There were other, less violent methods of resisting. Sometimes officials were beaten to make a message. The government had repeatedly pacified the populace by telling them that their expansionistic wars were actually defensive in nature. By the latter half of the 1600s, this argument had stopped working. The Swedish peasantry had gotten tired of sending their men off to die, and for rude soldiers, usually German mercenaries, to be forcefully quartered in their homes. Both conscription and the mercenary army were entirely abolished by the 1680s, and a new volunteering method of recruitment implemented. This formed the Carolean army, which inherited the discipline and religiosity of its Gustavian predecessor. If you enjoy the content I produce, consider supporting me monetarily on Patreon. You'll find the link in the video description. Otherwise, please give the video a like and a comment, so that YouTube will show it to more potential viewers. And why not share it with a friend? Cheers.